Continuing from last segment, I was mentioning that we were looking at the Middle Easterners and the Middle Eastern countries mostly from what I called Amero-Eurocentric perspective. When I say we, I mean the United States, the Europeans, and Israel for that matter. And we tend to view the people of the area as backward if their behavior is not similar to ours. And this is a good point to begin my next topic following the previous segment, and that is I want to talk about the perceptual base of the imperial stereotype. The imperial stereotype for me serves as a frame of reference for understanding not only the development literature, but also for understanding our policy in the region. So I'm going to be developing the imperial stereotype and other stereotypes throughout the course. But in this segment, I'm really going to focus more specifically on the imperial stereotype and ignoring for now the other stereotypes. And the argument is that we will persist seeing the people of the Middle East through this stereotype until they become more assertive, until they become what we call uppities, in other words, betraying the image we had of them. And then when that happens, then suddenly we're in for a kind of a shock because they didn't behave like Egyptian or like Iranians, the kind of imagery that we had built. Now, let me then begin with a more formal presentation of the imperial stereotype. And the imperial stereotype has three dimensions. And I want to discuss each of these dimensions. The first one is the dichotomizing elites. In other words, we tend to group the elites in the Middle East into two distinct categories. The first categories are what I call the WOGs. The term stands for, it's a British term, it stands for Westernized Oriental Gentlemen. And essentially what that means is that these are the elites who look to the imperialists, in the case of the Middle East, the British, the French, saw them as more advanced people and wanted to join them, wanted to be like them. So they went to school there and they adopted their values, they adopted their mannerism, they adopted their clothing. And so the WOGs were one group of elites that the imperialists in the Middle East dealt with. The other group were the agitators. The agitators were also the kind of people that you would expect to see among the elites as very well educated, and also people who were on par with the WOGs, except that even though they went to Europe for their education, they liked a different set of values in the British and in the French. They liked the idea of liberty, they liked the idea of freedom and democracy. And when they came home, they didn't appreciate being dominated by the imperial power, so they agitated to free their countries. So the elites in are, according to this perceptual mindset, falls into two groups, the WOGs and the agitators. Now, how did the British see the WOGs? That requires a bit of explanation. Really, the WOGs proved to the British that the natives, by golly, they can be educated and they can advance very far. They showed a lot of promise and almost were able to become Englishmen. Alas, they could not reach quite the level of Englishmen, very close, but no cigars. To give you an illustration of this, when my American mentor first went to Iran back in 1951, the first British he met was trying to tell him about the people of Iran. He said, the British man told my mentor, "The Persians are wonderful people. They make great servants. And some of them can learn to play polo. Now, polo, for those of you who know, was a game invented in Persia long before England even existed as a political entity. So it gives you some idea how these people from the imperial stereotype look at it. The French were a bit more generous. They allowed a select few portion of the elite to become truly a Frenchman or their peer. But the numbers were very small. Something like about 10% of the French population would fit that category. So the next thing I want to talk about is to talk about how we see the WOGs and how we see the agitators in terms of policy. The WOGs are essentially people we call moderate responsible. These are the people we really like. Moderate responsible in chief, if you're looking for some, here are some of them. President Sadat, President Mubarak, the kings of Saudi Arabia, and the kings of Jordan. These people are considered by us, the West, and particularly the United States. And by the way, the term moderate responsible is mostly an American version of the WOGs. These people are seen as people that are interested in stability. They don't want the change and rock the area in any way. They work very closely with Americans, and they don't see United States or Britain and outside powers as imperialists. They work with them. And in many ways, what you see is the kind of relationship that we have developed in promoting these moderate responsible. The term is unfortunate because when you look at the king of Saudi Arabia, you're going to be hard-pressed to find anybody on his right. I mean, to call him a moderate is just a flagrant abuse of that term. But it serves our purpose, because when we say we are for defending the moderate responsible, also remember they're responsible in the sense that they protect our interest. That's what makes them moderate, and that's what makes them responsible. The other side is, of course, the agitators. And here, the agitators are seen by those who look at the Middle East through the imperial stereotype as radicals, as extremists. So the WOGs want to accommodate us, and they accommodated the imperialists and the foreign powers. The agitators, on the other hand, were those elites who wanted the imperialists out of the area. So the first dimension of the imperial stereotype is what I've tried to explain to you, the dichotomizing elites. The elites fall into these two categories, which brings me to the second dimension. And the second dimension is how the stereotype of the Middle East, through imperial stereotype that I'm talking about, makes you view the masses. And here, the masses, the public, and even most of the elites in that category are seen as being pretty much childlike people. So this is the kind of a cliche. Let's explore what it means when you say the masses are seen as childlike. Well, notice the child has a long process to maturity. So in a sense, we are projecting how a child grows into the way the masses in much of the Middle East, as seen through the imperial stereotype, the kind of transition they have to go through until they reach maturity. And also notice that this pretty much matches the way we looked at development. The development process, the traditional society is also very similar to this, because you start with traditional society until you reach the developed society, which is us. Basically, therefore, we look at these people with having a culture that is distinctly inferior to ours. And this is what I later on will call the cultural distance point. The cultural distance is very, very large. So the question then becomes, what is the political implication of this image of the masses? In other words, what is the political implication when you see the masses as childlike people? And the answer to this terribly important question is, they don't have public opinion. In other words, you don't have to worry about public opinion in these societies. Now again, remember, this is related to the pre-mass versus mass politics society. In a pre-mass society, there really was no public opinion. But if there is public opinion, the imperial stereotype allows you to deny its reality by dismissing them, because you see them as culturally disadvantaged. And also notice there is another implication. If you really believe that there is no such thing as public opinion among the masses, then imagine how you're going to look at the agitators. What are the agitators up to? Well, the way you would see it, take Palestinians. The agitators, that is the elites that want to protect the Palestinian rights, they are seen only as selfish people that are solely interested in exploiting the masses who don't have a public opinion. So they're seen as demagogues exploiting the masses. And they do so purely for selfish and personal power reasons, to gain control of the masses. We don't give them the dignity that maybe they are very nationalistic and they don't want to be dominated by foreign powers. They're there just to exploit the masses. So what you see is there is no public opinion, and the agitators, of course, are there for their own personal gains. Now notice we have no problem understanding the importance of public opinion in the United States, in Europe, in Israel, or even in Russian. We know the Russian masses have public opinion. But also, if you have this perspective on the Middle Easterners, that is, you're seeing them through the imperial stereotype, you have a difficulty recognizing public opinion among these childlike people. And therefore, you have a difficulty taking them seriously. I should also point out that the masses in the Middle East, like elsewhere, are not politically sophisticated. If you start asking questions about the world politics, like everywhere else, including in this country, you're not going to get always very sophisticated answer. But they are not children without any opinion. They do have specific views on the role of the government and the expectation that they have from their government. So therefore, when you see King Hussein of Jordan, when he was alive back in 1990, giving a very strong support for Palestinian, even though he's a moderate responsible, and this happened after Iraq invaded Kuwait, he knew very well how important the public opinion pressures were in his country. Now, so one conclusion that I like to reach then is one implications of the seeing of the masses as immature is that they don't have any public opinion, and also there is another dimension to it, and that is, if you ask yourself, are these childlike people ready for democracy? And the answer is, if you believe in the imperial stereotype, your answer is no, they are not. And so when you think about our policy, throughout the 20th century, we operated under the assumption that these childlike masses of the Middle East were not ready for democracy. And so we decided to delude ourselves into thinking that the best way to prepare the Middle Eastern masses for democracy is first to have them live under repressive dictatorship, which eventually should get them ready and equipped for that crucial transition to Western democracy in some distant future time. So therefore we started to support all these dictators in the belief, or in the delusional belief, that they need time to mature, so it's okay to be under a repressive regime. And yet, when you think about how contemptuous this point of view is, think of how many of us believe that the illiterate and downtrodden masses who migrated to America, to American colony more than 200 years ago, were mature enough that we thought they deserved democracy. But Persians with well over 2,500 years of civilization are yet not mature, to deserve democracy. That certainly was our thinking in 1953 when we overthrew a democratic government with the help of CIA and replaced him with a royal dictatorship. Finally, the last dimension of the stereotype is the sense of powerlessness with which the societies in the Middle East are seen, if viewed through this kind of a stereotype that I mentioned. And this is a tendency on our part to see these people as powerless and incapable of learning. Notice that we don't view the Israelis that way, and you see a lot of evidence of that. For example, during the Cold War, if there was a conflict between Israel and, let's say, Syria, if Syrian Air Force performed exceptionally well against the Israelis, it must have been the Russians who were piloting the aircraft. It couldn't have been them. Syrians cannot learn very well. So we tend to grossly underestimate the capability of these people when viewed that way. And certainly this has been a problem for United States policy and also for Israel. This sense of powerlessness relates to viewing them as having a low sense of political efficacy. And the idea is that they really cannot learn. Again, it links up with the childlike person, that it takes time. It takes a long time for them to change. Actually, it's a good point here to note that Israel's view was changed after the Yom Kippur War of 1973, the shock of Egyptian army being able to cross the canal, which was everybody thought was impossible, really brought a reality check for a lot of the Israelis. Finally, I want to end this segment by talking a little bit about the policy implication of what I've called the imperial stereotype. There are policy implications with it. If you believe in these three elements of imperial stereotype, then the policy implication as to how do you control a society is readily suggested. The answer to it is the following. First, you need to manipulate the elites, because masses really don't count, they are the elites. And the way you do it is first by supporting the WOGs, the moderate responsibles, and you do that by giving them full support, by aid, as well as sometimes, if it becomes difficult, you may have to intervene on their behalf. And then the second part is do whatever you can to undermine the so-called agitators. And in the past, when agitators proved to be too powerful, sometimes we would engage in sponsoring a coup d'etat to overthrow their regime. And the last element, the masses, they don't matter. Remember, they're supposed to be childlike people without any public opinion. So all you need to do is to work things with elites. Now you can see how this is going to come back and hound us, because if the picture of the masses is incorrect, then the moderate responsibles are going to have a tough time controlling the masses, as you've seen in the case of Egypt, for example, more recently.